Ma'am, first class isn't for passengers like you. I'm going to need you to step back. Her voice was sharp, loaded with judgment, and it cut through the cabin like a slap in the face. And just like that, everything stopped. But before we get into what happened next, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And if this story already has your heart racing, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and tap that like button. All right. Now, buckle up. You're not going to believe how this all unfolded. It was just past 7 a.m. at Gate 27B, Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, Sky Atlantic Flight 313 to San Francisco. First-class passengers were boarding early, Zone 1. As always, the mood in the jet bridge was quiet but businesslike. Suits, heels, coffee cups, Bluetooth in ears, and fingers scrolling through unread emails. Dr. Celeste Morgan, 52 years old, walked with quiet confidence. She didn't need to dress flashy to be noticed. Navy slacks, a soft white blouse, and a travel wrap around her shoulders. No assistance, no fanfare, just grace and power wrapped in quiet restraint. In her right hand, she held her phone with her mobile boarding pass pulled up. In her left, a slim leather tote. She smiled at the gate agent. "Good morning, 2A. The agent scanned her ticket. It beeped green. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Morgan." She walked the jet bridge alone, her heels making muted contact with the carpeted floor. She turned left into first class. That soft, hushed space with chilled orange juice already poured and sunlight streaming in through oversized windows. Then it happened. As she reached row 2, a voice rang out. It wasn't warm, it wasn't helpful, it wasn't even neutral. "Ma'am, first class isn't for passengers like you." The voice belonged to Ava Kendall, a tall, stern-faced blonde in her late 30s, uniform pressed, posture stiff, lips painted a fierce red. She stood just ahead of the galley, one arm extended, blocking Celeste's path. There was silence, not just from Celeste, but from the passengers nearby. Some looked up, others just pretended not to see. Ava stepped closer. "Let me see your boarding pass." Celeste showed it to her without speaking. Ava didn't even take the phone, just glanced, then looked Celeste up and down, slowly, like she was measuring a threat. "This can't be right," she murmured. "Just a moment." She turned toward the galley, ignoring the uncomfortable tension she left behind. In seat 1B, Gregory West, gray-haired, silver cufflinks, nose buried in the Wall Street Journal, peered over the rim of his reading glasses. He smirked. "Someone lose their way to coach?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was just clear enough to carry. Celeste heard it. So did the rest of first class. No one said a word. Ava returned with a handheld scanner and began tapping. Then, with faux concern, she looked back at Celeste. "I'm sorry. I'm not seeing your name here. There may have been a system error. Would you mind stepping aside so we can clear this up?" Celeste raised her brow. Not angry, not embarrassed, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from fighting the same war on different battlefields. "There's no error," she said calmly. "I booked 2A 3 weeks ago. I'm right where I belong." Ava kept that tight, practiced smile on her face. "I understand, but this is a high-security route, and we've had some recent incidents. It's important that we confirm everything manually." Behind Celeste, the boarding line had paused. The curtain between first class and economy swayed slightly, open just wide enough for Marcus Hill, a young black flight attendant working coach, to catch a glimpse. His eyes widened when he saw her. He knew exactly who she was, but he didn't speak. Not yet. Celeste didn't move. "Ma'am," Ava pressed. Her voice clipped. "Step aside, or I'll have to involve the captain." That's when Lena Torres entered quietly from the rear. Dressed in civilian clothing, seated a few rows back. Lena was actually an internal compliance rep from Sky Atlantic's corporate office. She'd been assigned to this flight discreetly to evaluate customer service. She recognized the CEO immediately, and she waited, observing, calculating. Meanwhile, Gregory West chuckled again. Entitlement sure is getting creative these days. The insult lingered in the air like bad perfume. Ava didn't flinch. Moments later, the captain himself emerged from the cockpit. Brent Halverson, 61, white, neatly groomed, but with that permanent air of someone who didn't like surprises, especially not surprises that challenged his control. "What's the problem here?" he asked. Ava quickly filled him in, with her version. Of course. "Unconfirmed ticket, refuses to relocate, not on the manifest." Halverson turned to Celeste. "If you don't cooperate, we'll have to ask you to disembark while we sort this out." Celeste tilted her head. "You're asking the CEO of your airline, someone who owns 10% of Sky Atlantic, to get off her own plane?" Halverson blinked. Ava's face flushed, but she held firm. "We still need to verify." Celeste took one slow breath. "Then verify. I'll wait right here." But that's not what they wanted. Not quiet confidence, not poise. They wanted obedience. They wanted her gone. And so, within minutes, Officer Mason Clark, a uniformed airport security guard, boarded the plane with stiff shoulders and an authoritative voice. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." Celeste sighed, turned, and gathered her things. She didn't fight. She didn't argue. But the look in her eyes said everything. She walked down the aisle in silence, past the stunned passengers, past the open mouths, past the ones too afraid to say a word. Ava turned away, satisfied. Gregory West flipped his newspaper smugly. And the flight crew? They just resumed boarding, like nothing had happened. But something had happened. And in just a few minutes, the entire crew, and the world, would realize who she really was. The air outside the plane was colder than it should have felt for Georgia in spring. But maybe that was just how humiliation carried in the wind. Dr. Celeste Morgan stood silently near gate 27B, not pacing, not scrolling through her phone, just standing, calm, composed, as if the chaos that just played out never touched her. But inside, she felt it. Not the sting of embarrassment, but the heat of something deeper. It wasn't the first time she'd been misjudged. It probably wouldn't be the last. Officer Mason Clark stood a few feet away, posture rigid, his hand still resting on the clip of his utility belt, like he didn't know what else to do. He had no idea who she was. Not really. He just knew someone in a flight attendant uniform told him there was an issue, and he reacted. Just like that. Protocol. He called it. Celeste said nothing. Not yet. Inside the terminal, people were whispering. A few passengers who saw what happened had stayed back by the gate windows, watching her through the glass like she was a problem instead of a person. Ava Kendall had returned to the cabin. Captain Halverson was already back in his seat. And Gregory West? He was sipping orange juice in 1B like it was just another Tuesday. Then her phone vibrated. She checked the screen. Grace Holloway, assistant. She answered without hesitation. "It's begun," Celeste said quietly. On the other end, Grace's voice was steady. "Yes, ma'am. I've already activated Protocol 9. The board's been notified. Your legal team is standing by. Lena Torres just texted. She's still on board." Celeste nodded once. "Good. Tell legal I want their statements reviewed before release. No social posts, no interviews. We do this by the book," Grace replied. "Understood." Then added softly, "Are you okay?" There was a pause. Then Celeste said, "They told me I wasn't supposed to be in first class, that passengers like me don't belong." Grace inhaled sharply, but Celeste's voice remained calm. "I'm fine. This isn't personal. It's cultural. They've just never had to see power that looks like mine." She ended the call. Clark turned toward her. "So, are we going to settle this or not?" His tone was impatient now. Celeste tilted her head. "Settle what? Exactly?" Clark hesitated. "Look, ma'am, they said you weren't on the manifest. We had to act." "Did you check the manifest?" she asked, eyes steady. "Did you verify my name?" He looked down, clearly uncomfortable. I don't handle that directly." "Then you escorted a black woman off a plane without confirming a single fact. You don't even know who I am." She stepped 1 inch closer, her voice still soft. "Do you?" Clark stammered. "You're someone important. I get it now." She raised an eyebrow. "Say it. Out loud." He swallowed hard. "You're the CEO and part owner," she added. 10% of Sky Atlantic is mine." Just then, the gate agent, a young white man named Derek, rushed over, holding a tablet. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. I just reloaded the system. Your name is clearly listed in 2A. I think there was a sync issue with the handheld scanners. I don't know how this happened." Celeste looked at him with a measured expression. "It happened because no one thought to double-check. Because someone looked at me and decided I couldn't possibly belong." He nodded rapidly. "We're ready for you to reboard immediately. I'll escort you personally." Celeste didn't move. "No." He froze. "Ma'am?" She folded her arms. "I'm not stepping back on that plane until the captain makes the request himself, publicly, in writing, with an apology. I won't be treated like a criminal and then quietly return to my seat to protect the image of this airline." Derek blinked. "But the flight's being delayed." "Let it delay," she said. "Let it cost. That's how lessons are remembered." Behind the glass, passengers began noticing the delay on the monitor. Some were murmuring. Others pulled out their phones. From inside the plane, Lena Torres stood and walked slowly toward the cockpit. She paused at the curtain, turned to Ava, and said clearly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I think you're going to want to take a walk to the gate." Ava frowned. "Why?" "Because you just forcibly removed the CEO of this airline, and she's not coming back until you make it right." Ava's face drained of color. "What?" Lena leaned in. "Oh, and by the way, I work for corporate. I'm not just a passenger." Ava stood frozen for a long moment before stepping into the aisle, suddenly aware of how many eyes were watching her now. Back at the gate, Celeste remained still. Clark finally spoke again. "Is there anything I can do to make this right?" "Ma'am?" Celeste looked at him for a long moment. "Yes. Learn from this. And next time, verify before you act, especially when you're carrying a badge." At that moment, Captain Halverson appeared at the door. His jaw was tight, his voice even tighter. "Dr. Morgan," he said, "on behalf of Sky Atlantic, I apologize for the confusion. I've been informed of the mistake. We'd be honored to have you rejoin us in 2A. Celeste didn't smile. She just nodded. "Now you're speaking like a professional." She turned, accepted the tablet from Derek without another word, and walked slowly back toward the plane. As she reached the doorway, whispers rippled through the terminal. Someone said, "Is that her?" Another whispered, "She owns part of the airline." Inside the aircraft, the energy had shifted. Marcus stood near the curtain, eyes wide with something between pride and disbelief. Naomi Bennett in 3C had her phone angled just right. capturing a few seconds of the moment. Lena returned to her seat, silently locking eyes with Ava, who looked ready to be swallowed by the floor. Celeste stepped back into first class and paused. She looked down at 2A, the seat they tried to take from her, and with grace, not bitterness. She sat, not one word spoken. And yet, the silence said it all. The plane had gone quiet, that eerie, uncomfortable quiet that happens when everyone knows something just happened. But no one wants to be the first to speak. Dr. Celeste Morgan stepped back into the aircraft like she owned it. Because, in part, she did. Her steps were calm, not proud, not theatrical, just certain. And every pair of eyes in first class followed her, whether they meant to or not. Even those who'd pretended to be asleep were now watching. She moved past the curtain, back into the cabin that had rejected her only minutes earlier. It wasn't just a walk back to her seat. It was a return with meaning. Every step whispered, "You were wrong about me." Again. Gregory West, still in seat 1B, blinked and tried to pretend he hadn't said anything earlier. He shifted in his seat and pulled the newspaper back up, but his hands fumbled. Ava Kendall stood stiff at the front of the aisle, pale and flushed all at once, her eyes darting between Celeste and Lena Torres, who had taken her place back in row 4. Lena gave Ava a slight nod, the kind that says, "I warned you." Celeste reached seat 2A and paused for half a second, not to make a statement, but to breathe, to sit down in peace. She placed her tote beneath the seat, adjusted the armrest, and buckled in as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something irreversible, the kind of thing that makes people question themselves later, the kind of thing they replay in their heads while brushing their teeth or trying to sleep, the kind of thing that gets written about, or filmed. And it was being filmed. Naomi Bennett, seated in 3C, didn't try to hide her phone now. She was recording openly, steadily, not for drama, but for documentation, for truth, for proof of what power looks like when it doesn't have to shout. A few rows back, Marcus Hill peeked through the curtain. Their eyes met, his and Celeste's, and he gave her the smallest nod, the kind that only two people who've been through it can share. She nodded back. No words needed. Ava turned, whispering something to the other flight attendant. Her voice shook slightly. Her confidence cracked. Then she walked back to the galley, grabbed a bottle of still water, and returned to Celeste. She handed it over with a tight smile. "Water. Dr. Morgan?" Celeste accepted it, but didn't return the smile. She simply said, "Thank you," and then opened her laptop without looking up. On her screen, a paused email draft glowed. Subject, Board Compliance Review, Equity Audit Protocols. She scrolled to the bottom of the draft and added one line. "Use this flight as live case study. Names to be pulled from flight manifest." She clicked save. That was all. Then she closed the laptop again. Across the aisle, in seat 2C, Dr. Arjun Rao, a respected cardiologist from UCSF, looked over and cleared his throat. "Forgive me, Dr. Morgan," he said softly, "but I just want to say, what they did to you wasn't just wrong. It was embarrassing, for all of us watching, and you handled it with a kind of dignity I don't think I could have managed." Celeste turned her head, her expression still composed. "Thank you, doctor. But this wasn't just about me. This happens every day to people who can't fight back. That's who I'm thinking about right now." Arjun nodded slowly, then sat back in his seat, his respect evident in his posture. From behind, Naomi leaned forward. "Do you mind if I ask a few questions after the flight?" Celeste raised an eyebrow but didn't reject the idea outright. "We'll see." Naomi smiled. She knew better than to push. Meanwhile, Ava tried to maintain control. She checked seat belts. She repeated safety briefings, but her voice had lost its edge. She sounded human now, hesitant, unsure of the ground beneath her. The intercom crackled. Captain Halverson spoke, his voice as firm as ever, but carefully measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We're now ready for takeoff. A slight delay this morning due to a manifest correction has been resolved. We'll be departing shortly." Celeste raised an eyebrow. Manifest correction? That's how he wanted to frame it? She looked at Lena, who gave her the slightest shake of the head. Let it go for now. As the plane taxied, Naomi tapped out a tweet. Black woman removed from first class. Returned only after revealing she's the CEO and co-owner of the airline. We are witnessing the problem, not just hearing about it. She attached a still shot of Celeste reboarding. Within seconds, it began to spread. Lena's phone vibrated. Internal Slack channels were lighting up. Marcus saw the notification on his device in the back. Even ground staff were buzzing. Celeste leaned back in her seat, shut her eyes for just a moment, and let the hum of the engine soothe the tension in her shoulders. She didn't need an apology from the flight crew. She didn't need the captain's passive announcement. She'd already won, not by being loud, not by threatening anyone, but by showing them exactly what power looks like when it's quiet, unbothered, and undeniable. And as Flight 313 lifted into the sky, everyone on board knew the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. By the time Sky Atlantic Flight 313 reached cruising altitude, the tension in the cabin had morphed into a quiet unease, not just the kind that lingers after a confrontation, but the kind that makes people question what they just witnessed and whether they should have done more. Dr. Celeste Morgan sat in 2A, calm, legs crossed, her wrap draped loosely over her shoulder, flipping through briefing notes for her upcoming presentation in San Francisco. To the rest of the plane, she looked unbothered, but every movement around her now felt intentional. Ava, who once blocked her path with smug authority, was now operating on eggshells, keeping her voice low, her steps quiet, and avoiding direct eye contact at all costs. Even Captain Halverson stayed tucked away behind the cockpit door, making no further announcements. The passengers weren't stupid. They could feel it. Something had shifted, and the energy in the air was heavy with the knowledge that they'd almost let something truly disgraceful happen. Not to a celebrity or someone trending on social media, but to the woman who owned part of the very airline they were flying on. Gregory West, who had snorted earlier about coach passengers sneaking into first class, now sat frozen in his seat, barely touching his drink. The shame hadn't quite reached his lips yet, but it hovered close. Celeste had seen that expression before, the awkward silence of a man too proud to apologize and too smart not to realize he'd misjudged her. She let him sit with it. She wasn't here to teach him grace. That lesson would come whether he asked for it or not. From her window seat, she glanced across the aisle. Dr. Arjun Rao gave her a respectful nod before returning to his tablet, a few rows behind. Naomi Bennett was still typing furiously on her phone, no doubt turning her notes into something that would reach thousands by the time they landed. She wasn't just reporting, she was documenting, and she understood the weight of what she'd seen. This wasn't just another passenger removal gone viral. This was a systemic reflex in action, the default suspicion placed on a black woman in a position of quiet power. Naomi leaned forward slightly and spoke just loud enough for Celeste to hear. The post already has over 70,000 impressions. People are sharing it like wildfire. Celeste didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She just nodded. Let it move, she said. Let them feel it. In the galley, Ava was whispering to a junior attendant, her voice laced with anxiety. She really owns part of the airline? The young attendant nodded nervously. 10%, from what I heard. And she's the CEO. Ava looked toward the cabin, then back at the wall, eyes wide. I thought she was just, another executive flying for free. She bought her seat, the attendant said quietly. Weeks ago. Ava closed her eyes. God help me. Back at row 2, Celeste was now reviewing a document labeled Equity Training Initiative, Phase 2. She wasn't just processing the moment. She was already working on the solution. She adjusted one line in the draft. Mandatory cultural sensitivity retraining for senior flight crew to include real-world case studies. Then she added a bullet point. Use Flight 313. The flight crew didn't know it yet, but their faces, their actions, were about to become required viewing for the next generation of airline professionals. Across the cabin, Gregory West shifted again. Finally, he cleared his throat. Dr. Morgan, he said, voice low, almost humble. I believe I owe you an apology. I didn't know who you were. Celeste slowly turned her head toward him, expression calm but sharp. You shouldn't need to know who I am to offer me basic respect. Gregory blinked, visibly stung. You're absolutely right, he said after a long pause. And I am sorry. For real. She looked at him for a moment longer, then offered a simple nod. Thank you. No more. No less. Marcus Hill, the young black flight attendant in economy, quietly stepped forward and approached the first-class galley. He stood just inside the curtain, his eyes focused on Ava, but he spoke clearly enough for anyone nearby to hear. Dr. Morgan, he said, would you care for anything else? I'm happy to bring you a fresh coffee from the galley in the back. Ava tensed. Celeste looked up at Marcus with warmth. Thank you. Marcus, that would be lovely. He smiled. Cream and sugar? Just cream. He disappeared just as quickly as he came. But his presence mattered. He wasn't just offering service. He was making a statement, one of recognition, one of solidarity, one of quiet dignity. And Celeste received it exactly as it was meant. The engines hummed overhead. The clouds rolled past. But the atmosphere in the plane felt different now. Respect had replaced suspicion. Curiosity had replaced assumption. The same passengers who watched her get escorted off now glanced her way with a mixture of guilt and reverence. Not because she demanded it, but because she earned it, without raising her voice, without making threats, just by standing tall in the storm. Lena Torres glanced at her phone. A message from corporate had arrived. It read, confirm in-flight footage for internal review. Begin report draft. Board wants update by Cobb. She looked toward Celeste and sent a one-line reply. Already in motion. As the flight continued, no one dared speak out of turn again. No one questioned who she was. Because now, they understood. They weren't just flying with a passenger. They were flying with the woman who could change everything, and already had, at 35,000 feet, with the plane gliding smoothly above the clouds. The truth had a way of pressing down heavier than gravity itself. What had started as a quiet humiliation at the gate had now grown into a ripple of tension and revelation that stretched across the entire aircraft. Dr. Celeste Morgan sat in 2A, not just as a passenger, but as the living proof that leadership doesn't need permission to exist. She wasn't loud, she wasn't combative, but her presence had rewritten the power dynamic on board, and every crew member could feel it, especially Ava Kendall, who now stood quietly in the galley, hands clasped tightly behind her back, trying to compose herself. The once confident flight attendant was unraveling under the weight of a single, undeniable fact. She had tried to remove the woman who signed the very policies that governed her employment. She had publicly embarrassed the co-owner of the airline, and worse, she had done it not based on procedure, but on a snap judgment. Ava peeked through the curtain toward the front of first class, where Celeste now typed calmly on her laptop, from a distance. It looked like any other executive doing mid-flight work. But Ava knew better now. She wasn't working. She was documenting, preparing, building the foundation of a conversation that would reach the boardroom within hours of landing. On screen. Celeste reviewed the latest message from Grace Holloway. Media coverage has begun. CNN Business just reached out. Your name is trending on LinkedIn. #SheBelongs. Here is gaining traction. Celeste tapped out a reply with elegant precision. No interviews yet. Let the story breathe. We lead with action, not emotion. Just across the aisle, Gregory West sat stiffly, phone in hand, scrolling through news headlines with growing dread. One tweet had quoted him directly. Someone lose their way to coach? The comments were brutal. People were naming his company. Investors were already calling. He rubbed his temple and sighed. He hadn't even meant it as malicious. But that was the point, wasn't it? That's how deep the reflex ran. Celeste glanced in his direction. She could see the realization hitting him in waves. He wasn't a villain. He was a mirror, a reflection of the assumptions so many carried without ever questioning them. A moment later, Marcus Hill returned from the back of the plane with a fresh coffee. He placed it gently on Celeste's tray with a soft nod. Cream only, just how you asked. Thank you, Marcus, she replied. You didn't have to do that. He smiled, but his eyes were serious. I did. We all saw it. She looked at him for a beat, then nodded. Then let's make sure they don't forget it. He returned to economy, where he'd already earned silent respect from fellow crew for acknowledging her. It wasn't performative. It was genuine. From the galley, Ava watched every moment. She could barely breathe through the tightness in her chest. She knew what was coming. And just like that, her headset buzzed. Ms. Kendall, came the captain's voice. Please step into the flight deck at your earliest convenience. Ava swallowed hard and made her way toward the front. She disappeared behind the door, and for nearly 7 minutes, she didn't return. When she did, her hands trembled slightly. Her eyes were red. She resumed her duties like nothing had changed. But everyone could see it had. Lena Torres, still seated near the front, opened her work tablet. She had already begun drafting the initial findings of her in-flight compliance report. The opening line read, Observed incident qualifies as grounds for formal disciplinary review based on current equity standards outlined in the 2024 board mandate. Celeste saw her writing and gave a subtle nod. Quiet, efficient, focused, the way real reform always begins. A few rows back, Naomi Bennett was now finalizing her post for an editorial blog piece. She wasn't publishing gossip. She was publishing a case study. Her headline, What Happens When Bias Targets the Boss, a lesson at 35,000 feet. The subheading? Dr. Celeste Morgan didn't just reclaim her seat. She redefined who deserves it in seat 2C. Dr. Rao leaned over again, voice low. What you're doing, he said. I hope you know it's not just for you. It's for all of us who've ever been made to feel invisible in places we earned the right to be. Celeste turned to him, expression soft. That's exactly why I didn't walk away. He nodded, sitting back with a renewed sense of admiration. Time passed. Flight attendants returned to their routines. But no one forgot who was in 2A. Not anymore. And then came the most unexpected development of the flight. A soft chime from the intercom. It wasn't the usual safety reminder or weather update. It was the captain. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, this is your captain speaking. I'd like to take a moment to offer a formal acknowledgement. Earlier today, a valued passenger experienced an unacceptable delay in boarding. That passenger is Dr. Celeste Morgan, co-owner and CEO of Sky Atlantic Airlines. We recognize the error and are actively reviewing procedures to ensure our service reflects the standards she's helped build. The entire cabin fell silent. It wasn't much, but it was something. A beginning. Celeste didn't look up. She simply sipped her coffee and opened a fresh email draft. Subject line, Flight 313 debrief, immediate action required. She addressed it to the full board of directors. No anger, no fire, just facts, just truth. Because altitude doesn't cancel accountability, and dignity doesn't disappear at cruising speed. It reveals itself. As Flight 313 began its descent into San Francisco, the tone of the cabin was unlike anything Sky Atlantic's crew had experienced before. Not because there was turbulence or delays, but because everyone, crew and passengers alike, now moved with a strange reverence. The woman in 2A, the one they had once doubted, was now the quiet center of gravity in the room. No announcements could drown out her presence. No beverage cart could roll past her without its wheels slowing, as if even metal knew to pause. Dr. Celeste Morgan remained steady, hands folded over her lap, her coffee long finished, her laptop closed. She had made her statements, not through a press release or a confrontation, but through calm resolve and structured action. She had nothing more to prove. That work was already underway behind the scenes. Her assistant, Grace Holloway, had sent another secure message to her Sky Atlantic inbox just minutes before the final descent. Internal memo drafted, legal reviewed, PR embargo in place. Board has approved your protocol. We're ready for rollout pending your arrival. Celeste had read it twice, then added one line before sending it back. Initiate immediately. Change doesn't land after we do. It lands with us. In the back of the plane, Marcus Hill, still shaken by what he'd witnessed, prepared the cabin for landing. He looked toward first class, where Celeste sat calm as ever, and he stood a little taller. Just hours ago, he had felt powerless watching her be escorted out like she didn't belong. Now, he understood that presence doesn't need permission, dignity doesn't ask for a vote, and courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just keeps sitting in the right seat until the world corrects itself. Ava Kendall, visibly shaken but doing her job, approached Celeste quietly with a tray of hot towels. Her hands trembled slightly. Dr. Morgan, Celeste looked up, not unkindly, but firmly. Ava stopped speaking. Her words dried up under the weight of her own regret. If you're going to apologize, Celeste said calmly, do it after we land, and not just to me. Ava blinked. Yes, ma'am. Then she stepped back. Naomi Bennett closed her notebook, glanced at Celeste, and smiled faintly. I've been covering leadership for 15 years, she said under her breath. But this was a master class. Celeste didn't respond, but the corners of her mouth softened. Not a smile, just a quiet acknowledgement. As the city skyline came into view, the captain spoke again over the intercom. His tone was more careful now. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure all items are stowed and seatbacks are in the upright position. And once again, thank you for flying Sky Atlantic. The aircraft tilted gently into descent. Seatbelts clicked, trays folded. But the true shift wasn't in the altitude. It was in the atmosphere. Something unspoken had settled over the flight, something that couldn't be erased by landing gear or terminal doors. The moment the wheels touched down, a chime sounded, and the pilot spoke again. Cabin crew, cross-check and prepare for arrival. The engines quieted. The brakes hissed. And just like that, Flight 313 rolled into its gate at SFO. Then came the announcement Celeste had anticipated. Dr. Morgan, please remain seated briefly. Sky Atlantic leadership will be meeting you at the gate. She nodded once. Of course they would. She had not requested a meeting, but the message had already landed before she did. The plane parked. The doors opened. First-class passengers began to stand, gathering their bags, casting sideways glances at Celeste as if unsure whether to speak or offer silence. Dr. Rao, seated beside her, offered a quiet word. "Thank you for not letting them get away with it." She gave him a soft glance. "No one gets away with anything. Not forever." One by one, passengers deplaned, some stealing nervous glances, others offering respectful nods. Naomi paused before exiting, leaned in, and whispered, "I won't name names in my piece, but I will name what matters." Celeste nodded. "Good. Name the silence." Finally, the cabin was nearly empty. Ava stood by the galley, eyes lowered. Marcus came forward to say goodbye, his voice quieter than before. "Thank you for not yelling," he said. "If you had, they would have twisted the whole thing." Celeste placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes silence does more damage than shouting, but don't be afraid to speak when it matters." Then she reached down, picked up her tote, and stood. Her movements were slow, deliberate, but commanding. When she stepped off that plane, 3 Sky Atlantic executives were waiting, including the COO, the VP of Customer Experience, and the Director of Flight Operations. All 3 looked uncomfortable, but not because they didn't recognize her. They were uncomfortable because now they did. "Dr. Morgan," the COO began, extending a hand. "We owe you more than an apology." She accepted the handshake, but not the apology. Not yet. "You owe every black woman who's ever been treated like I was an apology. You owe your crew better training. You owe your passengers better standards. And you owe your shareholders better judgment." The silence that followed was heavier than any turbulence. Then she added, calmly, "You'll be receiving the full framework of the Morgan Standard by noon. It will be non-negotiable." The VP nodded quickly. "We'll implement immediately." "No," she said. "You'll implement after you understand why it exists. Otherwise, it's just window dressing." She didn't wait for a response. She walked through the terminal calmly, passing cameras, hushed voices, and flashes of recognition. She wasn't just a CEO now, she was a symbol, not of anger, not even of power, but of what it looks like when a woman knows exactly who she is and refuses to sit anywhere but where she belongs. The next morning, headlines didn't just cover what happened on Flight 313, they dissected it. But not in the way airline controversies usually went viral. There were no shaky cell phone videos of yelling, no security dragging passengers down aisles, no hashtags demanding boycotts. What made this story different was the silence, the cold, quiet moment when a black woman with power was told, "This seat isn't for you," and how she responded not with rage, but with dignity so sharp it cut through the cabin and reshaped an entire industry's view of what leadership looks like. By noon, major media outlets were quoting excerpts from Naomi Bennett's editorial. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't threaten lawsuits, she simply sat, in the seat she earned, and let the world adjust to the weight of her presence. At Sky Atlantic headquarters, internal communications exploded. The compliance report Lena Torres submitted became mandatory reading by end of day. Crew across the country were instructed to complete emergency equity retraining. And in bold letters on the intranet homepage, a new directive had been uploaded, titled The Morgan Standard. It began with a sentence that would echo far beyond that airline. Respect should never be determined by perception, only by truth. Under the new policy, all flight attendants and gate agents would receive recurring anti-bias training developed in partnership with leading civil rights scholars. Crew would also be required to complete immersive simulation protocols that addressed unconscious prejudice in high-stress situations. But what stood out most was the final clause. In every training, Dr. Celeste Morgan's case will be used as a live, real-world example of why reform is not optional. It's overdue. Back in San Francisco, Celeste didn't make a media appearance. She didn't post a video. She simply got to work. That afternoon, she delivered her keynote address at the National Health Equity Summit. As originally scheduled, the room was packed. She spoke not of airlines or injustice, but of systems. How deeply rooted assumptions corrode institutions from the inside, and how change must begin in the smallest reflexes of human interaction. She closed with one line. Equity isn't about creating space at the table. It's about making sure no one gets asked to leave just because they weren't expected to arrive. The applause that followed was long, not loud. It was the kind of applause born from understanding, not just admiration. After the event, Grace Holloway approached her in the hallway, holding a stack of folders. "Press is still requesting interviews," she said softly. "We've received requests from CNN, Forbes, and even The View." Celeste glanced at the folders, then back at Grace. "We'll do one interview, but not for ratings. We do it to set the record straight. Then we move on." Grace nodded. "Understood." Celeste exhaled deeply and looked out the window. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that stretches wide over the bay like a quiet promise. She'd been through worse. She'd fought through boardrooms where she was the only woman, the only black person, the only one without a legacy last name. She'd pitched ideas in rooms where investors looked right through her. She'd built her company from one laptop and a borrowed desk at a community center on the south side of Chicago. She'd sacrificed weekends, friendships, even her health at times, to prove that brilliance should never be disqualified by appearance. But she had never expected, after all this time, to be told, flat out, that she didn't belong in the seat she paid for. Still, in a strange way, she was grateful, not for the insult, but for the moment, the proof, the living, breathing case study of how prejudice still lives quietly in polished uniforms and professional smiles, and how to dismantle it without shouting, without collapsing into bitterness. A week later, the internal memo she wrote, the one outlining her experience and Sky Atlantic's response, was picked up by Harvard Business Review. They titled the article, "Power, Perception, and the Quiet Flight That Changed Corporate Policy." Flight crews from other airlines began requesting copies of The Morgan Standard. Diversity officers asked for speaking engagements. Universities reached out for case rights. And while Celeste politely declined most, she agreed to speak at two places that meant the most to her, her old high school in Chicago and the local aviation training center in Atlanta, where many young black and brown flight attendants got their start. At the high school, she stood in front of a group of teenage girls, some wide-eyed, some skeptical, all listening. She told them the full story, not just what happened on Flight 313, but what happened afterward. "You may walk into rooms where people assume you're in the wrong place," she said. "They may stare, question, even dismiss you, but you don't correct them by shrinking. You correct them by continuing to stand, calmly, firmly, and then you take your seat." The auditorium fell into deep silence, followed by thunderous applause. At the Aviation Training Center, she didn't bring a speech. She brought a single photo, a still image from Naomi's article. It showed her re-entering the aircraft, quiet, tall, eyes forward. While passengers looked on in stunned silence, she placed it on the screen and said, "This is not a walk of shame. This is a walk of return. Never let the uniform make you forget who's really flying the plane," one young trainee asked. "How did you stay so calm?" Celeste smiled, then answered slowly, "Because when you've spent your life building something real, you don't have to shout to be heard. Your work will speak. Your legacy will speak. And eventually, your silence will be louder than anything they can throw at you." As she walked to her car that evening, she received a final message from Marcus Hill. It was just a short note. "Thanks to you. I finally spoke up during a staff meeting today. First time I didn't let it slide. Celeste smiled, not because it made her feel powerful, but because it reminded her why she started. The fight had never been about just her seat. It was about every seat after hers, every Marcus, every passenger who didn't look the part, every worker afraid to say something, every unseen voice waiting for permission to speak, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting gold along the San Francisco skyline. Celeste stepped into her car, closed the door, and sat in silence for just a moment. Not out of weariness, but out of peace. And that, more than anything, was the victory. Not headlines, not applause, just knowing that change had already taken flight. And this time, it would land. Thank you for being here. If this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter.